We are very pleased and honored to have with us Professor Woloschak, the Associate Director of Research in the Department of Radiation and Oncology in Northwestern University. Would you care to introduce yourself to us?
What do you want to know? I mean, so I am a scientist. I do radiation research and I do nanotechnology research. That's my most important job. But I also have been working in science-religion dialogue for probably 15 years. So in addition to my PhD in science, I also have a Doctor of Ministry in Eastern Christian Studies. So then I teach at Lutheran School of Theology, I teach at St. Vladimir Seminary, and I teach at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary.
Thank you. Now, Professor Woloschak, you are one of the leading experts in the field of Orthodox Christianity and science. How did you decide to work on this subject?
Oh, this is like so funny. I mean, I was working at the time at a government lab in the US, Argonne National Lab, which is just outside Chicago. And the guy who had an office next to me said, "Oh, Gayle, I need somebody to teach a course, give a lecture in our science religion class on evolution." And this was at Lutheran School. And I said, "Oh, okay, sure, I'll do it." So I did it, and then I did it the next year, and then I did it the next year. And after about 6 or 7 years, he says, "Okay, I'm retiring, and you've got to take over the whole course." So I took over the whole course. And then I felt like, I don't know, that it's just not right for me to be teaching and not have credentials in theology. So I had a master's degree already in Orthodox theology, so I went ahead and did my Doctor of Ministry degree so that I'd have both the science and the Orthodox part of it. So.
What were some influential books or scholars that inspired you in your pursuit of the subject?
Oh boy, it's hard to answer. So my very favorite, probably the most influential, is Sergei Bulgakov, who was a great theologian, I think undiscovered till recent times, died in 1949. He was from the Russian emigre group to France. Zizioulas, of course, has had big influence because he is one of the few people that talks about science and religion. Stanilwe, who is the Romanian scholar, he had done a lot of work on science and religion from an Orthodox perspective. So probably those three would be the most important from an Orthodox view. There are some non-Orthodox scholars I've also read and written about. Sir Arthur Peacock, who was the great Anglican scholar. I actually studied his life. I met his wife, had to do a session on him, and he was just fascinating. I think he left science, became an Anglican priest, and I think he left really because he felt like people were not going to believe in God because of evolution. And he said, no, you can believe in God and believe in evolution both, and that's why he became an Anglican priest. So it was kind of a cool story.
You've already mentioned how you came to your doctorate in theology, but how did you decide to get a degree, a master's degree in Eastern Christianity in the first place, after working so many years?
So, you know, it's like one of those things. I was sort of always interested in Orthodox theology, and I sometimes think that drove my interest in science, because there are like some common themes for science and religion that people don't pay that much attention to. I mean, we talk a lot about how everybody's seeking truth, but there's also sort of the method of learning is really similar. I mean, in theology, we have a spiritual advisor, a spiritual father who tells you and gives you advice, who you go to and helps you through your life, right? And in science, you have a mentor. And that mentor works with you, teaches with you one-on-one, and helps you to become a good scientist. So you don't learn it you learn it some by studying books, but you learn it more by doing it. And that's sort of true for Orthodoxy, right? You learn it by doing it and by being the good person. And the same thing is true for science. You learn how to be a good scientist by doing it.
Professor Woloschak, some of your recent work has focused on an Orthodox Christian perspective of ecology. Would you like to share your views on this subject?
Yeah, so ecology is one of those issues that I think is very important, and maybe more important today in today's political climate. I feel like I teach a whole course on it at Lutheran School, and it's called The Future of Creation. I feel a lot as though we are ignoring the things that humanity is doing to destroy nature, and that we need to develop approaches that can help. And I actually think Orthodox theology answers those questions really well, better than many of the other theologies do. We have a theology of caring for earth, caring for creation, that is very important. The Ecumenical Patriarch has been, I think, foremost in that, which is interesting. But there's another interesting thing that I find in all of it. You know, sometimes when you deal in the interfaith community and you have Muslim scholars and Buddhist scholars and Jewish scholars and Christians of many denominations, and you're all talking about what your religion says, you have big disagreement. But when you talk about something kind of outside of you, you know, so you talk about environment, it's actually something we can all agree on. So I find that there's a beauty in that, and we might be able to kind of team up together to help fight the environmental issues rather than constantly be fighting over, you know, who's right and who's wrong.
Biology, and especially evolution and Darwinism, has been a recurrent theme in the science and religion interaction. What would you say could be an orthodox take on this subject?
Yeah, so I've done a lot of thinking about evolution. Evolution is a very hard issue because it's actually complex. And there's this tendency to see a fight between the creation stories in Genesis and the biological evolution story that we teach in schools. I don't think they're in conflict. I don't think the Genesis story is meant to be a scientific story or a scientific description. And we make a mistake when we look at that. And in fact, what I really think happens is when we look at Genesis as a scientific description, we lose the real story that's there. I mean, you know, there are things that story's supposed to tell us. It's supposed to tell us that creation is good, that when humanity came along, it became very good, that we're meant there to be in communion with God, that we're meant to be in communion with each other, that we have responsibility for creation. I mean, even that story where Adam is naming the animals, I mean, you know, what things do we name? We name our children, we name our, I don't know, in Greek tradition, doesn't the godparent name the godchild, right? I mean, I name my Greek godson. I mean, and what it means is that it's talking about responsibility. When you name something, you take responsibility for it. And so when Adam named the animals, it was a way of saying, you have responsibility for those animals, you better take care of them. So it goes back to that ecology story as well.
The new biology has led to the development of new sets of tools for the scientists to use in the quest to solve mysteries of human disease, biomolecular structure, function, relationships, and other burning biological questions, including gender issues. How do you think Orthodoxy could contribute to these discussions and treatments?
Yeah, so I get frustrated because I feel like Orthodox are sometimes not at the table. I'll give an example. So the Lutheran bishops in the Chicago area, they invited me to come and talk about CRISPR-Cas9. I asked Orthodox bishops, what do you think about CRISPR-Cas9? And not one of them knew what it was. But here the Lutherans are asking me to come talk to them about it. So it's not just they know about it, but they actually believe it's a problem. So what is it? It's a method for being able to edit the genome. And it's actually possibly going to be approved in US for editing embryos, provided that it's to treat disease. So this will be the first time ever that we have the technology to go in, that we're allowed to use the technology to go in and actually change the genome. That has big implications. I mean, it has implications for sort of who we think of ourselves as human beings, how much of our genome is kind of who we are. And, you know, if we make mistakes, we could have problems, you know. I mean, if you edit a cow's genome and it doesn't work out right, well, you can go kill the cow. But what are you going to do if you edit human genome and you don't do a good job of it? So I guess the bottom line is I don't think we're at the table for many of those discussions, and we need to be. I don't know how to push that, but this SO project, which is actually trying to look at science and orthodoxy in the world, I think that that's a big, big step forward because it's forcing Orthodox to talk about these issues. And I don't think we should just be talking about it among Orthodox. I think we should be talking about it with other religious groups too, so that we can sort of have an influence there. Okay, so the story is that Leonard Hummel is a Lutheran pastor, and he had a scientist working with him on this book, and the guy bailed out. And Leonard, I teach at a Lutheran seminary, and Leonard heard about me, and he said, Gayle, the person that was working with me on this can't do it anymore. Would you be willing to do it? So next thing you know, Leonard and I are doing a book on understanding cancer as a disease of evolution. Actually, it's interesting because cancer evolves in the body just like evolution takes place. And there are pastoral perspectives that help people understand their disease a little bit better, that make it a little bit more clear to them how they should think about their disease. So Leonard's sort of the pastor who deals with it, and I'm sort of the scientist that's telling the scientific story. So hopefully the book will be out this year.
Beautiful, yes.
So you think that the so-called field of bioethics, it's a field that has drawn the attention of some scholars within Orthodoxy and within the smaller community of Orthodox and science relationship scholars. Do you think that bioethics is a field that Orthodox Christianity can really make an impact?
Yeah, so I actually teach bioethics at St. Vladimir's Seminary. And I don't think I would teach it unless I believed it was really important. Probably Orthodox, so there are people that believe that ethics should not even be considered a field in Orthodoxy because it's about living the faith and not about just how we practice things. But I disagree with that. I think that if we're not helping the world to shape its ethics, then we're not doing what part of our job is. We need to take stands on things. We need to make commitments to understand different perspectives on all kinds of things that are ethically related. And I mean, it goes everywhere from this Cas9 CRISPR technology that I just mentioned to how we deal with people with diseases, all kinds of things. It's interesting to me because science actually shapes the ethics to some extent. So when HIV was first discovered, when AIDS was first discovered and nobody knew that HIV was the cause, in the US they talked about putting people in camps and quarantining them and everything else. But then when we knew that the cause was HIV and we knew that you could live in the same house with people with the disease and not catch it, then now it was no longer ethical to talk about putting them in camps. So science actually drove the ethics. So I think that the church is sort of an interpreter of what's appropriate and what's not, needs to be involved in that dialogue very distinctly.
Recently, you also wrote on the question of technology in relation to Orthodox Christianity. Taking into account the prevalence of technology in contemporary life, how would you see an Orthodox viewpoint on technology development?
Yeah, so the question about technology is a very complex one. First of all, scientific discovery is moving very rapidly. The time that it takes to go from discovery to actual application is much less now than it was even 5 years ago. This genome editing technique that everybody's talking about, that probably is going to be 2 years, maybe 3 years from discovery to application. That's incredible. So then what should the Orthodox perspective be on that, on all technologies? I think that we believe that technology is a gift from God. Knowledge is a gift from God, but it's how we use it. And that's where the question of ethics comes in. So you could take technology and use it for bad purposes, or you could use it for good purposes. The example I use oftentimes is, there are atomic bombs where we blow people up with radiation, and then there's the cancer treatments that come from radiation. Same technology, just different applications. And then I'll go a step further. It's not just how we use it, but it's also how we control it. So, for instance, with Chernobyl, we didn't take good care of our technology there. So the Ukrainian government had problems with a reactor. They should have shut things down long ago. They were not good caretakers of the technology. So it's about how we use it. It's about using it for good approaches, but it's also being a good caretaker of those of the technology as well. So it's a complicated issue.
You are one of the scholars who have initiated a dialogue with Orthodox Christianity while being an active scientist with a dual expertise in both. You co-edited one of the first collective of essays on this subject. How do you see the current status of the field of science and religion, and how do you see the field moving forward in the future?
So the field of science and religion, for me, before probably even 6 or 7 years ago, was very much not an Orthodox question. There were a very few scholars who were working in Orthodoxy and science. Most of what I did as science-religion dialogue was through the Lutheran Church, because I taught at a Lutheran seminary, through some of the dialogue I had locally. I even did dialogue with at the Jewish synagogues in town. So it was a very interfaith dimension. I tried and pushed for Orthodox to get involved in it, and happily Orthodox have been entering into the dialogue. I think it's critical that we're there. I think it's important that we have the dialogue among ourselves in order to help figure out where we stand. Dialogue about science and religion is very complicated. Putting scientists in the same room as theologians, sometimes there's a different vocabulary, there's a different way we understand things, and that's hard. It takes time to be able to even communicate. But then I think that once we reach ourselves and our Orthodox dialogue, we need to pick up our dialogue and move it into the broader dialogue that's going on, just so we can have some influence over the field.
You have also written on Maximus the Confessor's theology and compared his work to St. Augustine. Would you like to describe your argument?
Yeah, so Maximus is really, I think he's an exciting scholar who some people think is being overused these days, but I think we Orthodox have not paid as much attention to him as we should. There are a couple of things I think, one point I think that's really important for what he said is that a lot of people try to talk about the interface between science and religion and how they interact together. Maximus actually tried to say that it's not just about the sort of Bible versus science. He tried to put in a dimension that said that there's a spiritual dimension too, that kind of goes over that dialogue between the Bible and science. And that spiritual dimension, I think, is really important. It's something that needs explored. It's something that speaks very much to us today.
You actually answered my next question as well. So, apart from Maximus the Confessor, who really seems to be getting a lot of attention from Orthodox scholars, there have been other attempts at using patristic knowledge and works from fathers to answer the question of how Orthodoxy and science can talk to each other or interface. And other suggestions have been Byzantine scholars of the late 14th century, or even the early Cappadocian fathers who very specifically integrated the worldviews of their time, we should call the philosophical worldviews of their time, in their Christian teaching. Do you have other fathers of the church in mind who would be susceptible, who could act as inspiration for rejuvenating the Orthodox Christianity science?
So I worry about trying to go back and, I think we have to interpret the fathers in the age in which they wrote. So for instance, St. Basil the Great was fabulous because he wrote his Hexameron, which was about, the days of creation. You can read that in a kind of literal sense and capture what he intended. He certainly didn't know anything about evolution, but what was cool about what he wrote was he talked about a changing creation and how creation was dynamic. And so even though he didn't know about evolution, you can go back and sort of read evolution into what he wrote. And if you believe in a changing, dynamic creation, what would that look like? In his day, I'm not sure he knew what that would look like, but today we can actually say, it looks like evolution. Many of the other church fathers, I think, that had discussions about the material and the non-material world, like Saint John Climacus. Saint John of Damascus. Those could also, I think, relate very well to what we find today. But there's always that need to take what the church fathers said and kind of try to develop their mind, not just to say, oh, this is what he said, this is how it applies to us, but more or less understand the mind of the fathers and apply it to the problems and the questions we have today.
There has also been an argument put forward, or a viewpoint, both from scholars within the larger science and religion field and within the Orthodox Christianity and science field, that science is a moving target, and trying to always catch up with a moving target is not perhaps the optimal strategy. As a researcher, an active researcher on the science, what would your opinion on this be?
Yeah, so science is a moving target. It is going very fast. I think though, if we just sit back and don't do anything, then it's going to become a runaway freight train and nobody's going to be able to make comments, understand it, or go any further. The other thing is that I actually think science sort of needs religious debate to help it out too. The scientists are sort of embedded in this very materialistic view of the world. We need to make scientists think outside of their comfort zone, outside of their box. They'll be better scientists for it, they'll be better people for it. So that we have to fight on this battlefront, not just because it will help orthodoxy, but also it will help science.
Which characteristics of Orthodox Christianity would you say that set it apart from other Christian denominations when considering its interaction with science?
So, I don't know. I think Orthodoxy is actually the best for being able to address science-religion issues. I know there are others that would disagree with me, but I think there's an openness in Orthodoxy that we have that you won't find in many other traditions. They have a sort of fixed view on how they look at the world, and that's not the way it is in Orthodoxy. The second thing is that we respect the diversity of ideas, and in our discussions, we can express many, many different views in the room and try to use that discussion to reach kind of a consensus that we agree upon. But 5 years from now, we can change our minds on it and say, hey, we weren't so good there, let's go back and relook. I don't think there's as much openness in many other denominations. They sort of feel like when they make a statement, they have to stay by that forever. And I think we're willing to go back and re-examine ourselves and look carefully and try to do a better job to fix it over time.
In the same vein, in the same stream of questions, are there unique perspectives on science that Orthodoxy has to offer that may have been overlooked or otherwise missing from Western Christian discussions and treatments?
So, I'm sorry, you'll have to say it again because I didn't follow. So you're asking if science, if there are things that science that we overlooked in Orthodoxy?
The other way around. If there are unique perspectives on science that Orthodoxy has to offer that have maybe been overlooked from Western Christian discussions.
Yeah. Okay, so what I would say, I think Orthodoxy can bring to the discussion in science several concepts that are very important. Number one is our idea of personhood. And our idea of understanding people in relationship is very important. That's going to play a very important role in psychology and psychodynamics, but it also plays a role in trying to understand who a human being is. I mean, the person is not just their biology, but they are their biology. And they're not just their psychology and their environment, but they are their psychology and environment. How those interact to make a full person, I think Orthodoxy has an understanding of personhood much better than many others. The other dynamic that I love in Orthodoxy, and I use this, I actually use this in my evolution stories. It has to do with the fact that we become persons in relationship. So how do we form relationships with people? We do because of language to a large extent, because we talk. By talking, we understand each other better. And, who's the logos, the word, is is God and Christ. And so there's the idea that when two people are talking, Christ is somehow embodied there with them. Now, if you think about it from the science perspective, you can start to ask, when did human beings become human? And I think it had a lot to do with when they started to talk. We are the only species that actually really talks. So that language issue, I think, is very important, both from orthodoxy and also from science. She's going to cough, and I'm going to take a sip of water, so we're going to take a break. We must be having the same cycle, because when you have to cough, I'm like, yeah, I got to cough too.
Yes, thanks for places we synchronize.
So is this going okay?
Yeah, it's going great.
Okay.
Άλλη ερώτηση που είχαν κάποιους που κάνουν, δεν ήταν μέσα, αλλά...
Ναι, όχι, είναι μια χαρά. Αυτό είναι το θέμα, να προκύπτουν και άλλα.
In the opposite direction, if I may move
Sure.
discussion in the opposite direction, what areas would you say remain underexplored in the Orthodox science dialogue from the perspective of the Orthodox Christianity?
Probably just about everything. I mean, we haven't been that active at the table. Evolution, while it is a little bit discussed, it's such a very broad topic, it needs much better discussion than it currently has. This idea of personhood and becoming a human person, and relating that to psychology, I think is very important. Issues of sexuality are very poorly discussed. I mean, we talk about them in some sort of legalistic sense, but I think we don't understand it from an Orthodox view all that well. I would say probably the one area that maybe we're good at is environment and ecology, because the Patriarch has taken a lead to try to discuss that. But as the world becomes, in worse shape, I think, environmentally, maybe it's something we need to keep talking about despite everything. Bioethical issues are becoming really big right now, and we really aren't doing that much about them, such as this gene editing technology, some of the other issues that involve how we should treat, when do we stop treating patients? What about in vitro fertilization? What about cloning? There are a lot of those issues that we just barely touch.
What role could Orthodox Christianity play today in current scientific practice? Vice versa, how could science affect the practice and experience of Orthodox Christianity? Some of them you have already answered, but
yeah. So I think science could benefit a lot from. I think it can benefit a lot from any sort of dialogue with religion. In fact, I firmly believe that that's a good thing. In my community, I actually did an article recently on being an Orthodox Christian scientist and how hard it is, because in the scientific community, it's just, you don't talk about your religion, and the few people that do are sort of in trouble. I mean, I joke about this, but this is really a true story. I was on a list to be invited to speak at a conference in Germany, and when they found out that I taught a course called the Epic of Creation, which is actually an evolution course, by the way, they took me off the list because, she's one of those people that's religious, so we don't want her on our course. So I think there is a big problem between scientists and faith and people of faith. But what I think scientists do, when I try to talk to them a little bit further about it, for the ones I know well, is they're so married to their materialistic way of thinking about things. I mean, think about it, all they do is think about materialistic things all day long. So now, helping them to come out of that materialistic, view, I think that will help them be better people. It'll help them be better with their families. It'll help them be better with their students. I mean, I think all around it would be a better thing. If we take it from the reverse side, how could, say, the church benefit from science? Well, first of all, we have to realize that's where our students are today. I mean, our young people, they're getting science education in school. They're going to university, they're learning about science. And if we don't have questions, if we can't answer their questions, then there's something wrong. So we better be able to engage those things. I mean, when a student goes into a church and hears the priest saying that evolution is wrong, what's going to happen to that kid? He or she's going to say, I don't believe this anymore, and walk away. I've had students come up to me after a talk on evolution, and they say, where have you been all my life? Nobody told me that it was okay to believe in evolution. I mean, it's really sad that it's just like, it's just by chance that we managed to get together and I say those things to them. So I think that we can help our church grow by being open. And besides that, if science and religion are both looking at truth and Orthodoxy is looking at truth, then scientific truth should be acceptable to Orthodox too.
What are or should be, from your point of view, the limits of the dialogue between science and Orthodox Christianity?
I don't know if I believe in limits, so I'm not sure that there should be anything that we would consider to be off limit. I think that there are certain things that science cannot answer, and scientists basically know that. I don't think we can answer things about God very easily. I mean, I think we can answer things about nature that might be a reflection back to God, but I don't think that we can answer questions about God. So science, I think, is limited just by virtue of that. But I don't think that I would think that there's anything I would say, oh, we don't talk about this. But I will say that when you do create a discussion, it's often useful to say, we're only going to talk about these items because there's so much to talk about that you could go on and never have the sides discuss the same issues.
This I think you...
Let's ask it again.
Yes,
Not ask
you
this
already.
because we said that, didn't we? Let's ask this.
Yes.
What did you say?
What thinkers, intellectuals, or scholars would you identify as being especially prominent in the contemporary science and Western Christianity interaction?
So a lot of the scholars are people who, who have been, I guess I'm not supposed to say this, but they're here at this meeting. I mean, Chris Knight has been very good in his discussion of science, religion. Several of the speakers that are here, whose last names I can't pronounce because they're Greek. I'm sorry, you guys. This is not a good question for me because I won't be able to answer it. So I take a break for a minute. But I can't pronounce their last names. I'm not going to be able to do it well, so I feel bad. Like Efthymios has been great. Panteli. I mean, but I can't say their last names. The only one I can say is Teli Papanikolaou because he's my friend, and I've known him for decades. So.
I think we reached the end, but
I think that's more or less what our script would have to say. But
Is there something you would like to say on the subject that we did not ask?
I don't know, you guys were pretty thorough. I can't think of anything right now, but I'll sit here for 1 minute and think about it.
Actually, there was one question we were skeptical about asking, but
I think it was a question that Maria really pushed for. I think we should ask, and it's about the gender issue on Orthodox Christianity, especially as it relates to the science and Orthodox Christianity. You seem to imply.
So which gender issue? Are you talking about like homosexuality? Are you talking about transgender?
Whatever you would like to your opinion on the subject.
Okay, so
yes, concerning sexual and gender.
So in my opinion, homosexuality, for instance, is an issue where the science disagrees with the church. At least I don't know what the views are in Europe, but in the U.S. right now, homosexuality is considered to be normal. It's not a psychological diagnosis. There's no way that you can reverse it. It's considered to be the way a person is born. And if that's the case, then who is the church to say that it's a sin or that it's wrong if the person has no control over it? And so, in my opinion, it's a battle. It's one of the places, it's a battle zone between the church and science. Something has to happen to resolve that. What I've been pushing for is to have dialogue. I think the church has to understand where the science is coming from, and then I think that science needs to see what the church is saying and what their views are on it. But I think there needs to be some sort of open discussion on that topic very strongly, because in the US it's hurting very much. I mean, kids go to school, they have friends who are gay, who they relate to, they talk to every day, and then they come to the church and suddenly they're not even supposed to deal with this. I mean, I don't know if I want this on the record, but I'll say it anyway. If you guys want to use it on the tape, go ahead. I know of a situation in my own parish where a young man who I had in church school, he got married to his partner who, it was a gay marriage. And the priest preached from the altar for 3 weeks about how gay marriage is wrong. And the grandmother of the son came up to me and said, "Gayle, what do I do? Do I go to his wedding? What do I do?" And I said, "Look, you have to go to the wedding. I mean, no matter what you think, I mean, you love him. You may be his only support when he's in trouble. Go to the wedding." So they end up going to the wedding, but I think it wouldn't have been such a difficult issue if the priest hadn't, said all this from the altar. But, here's this kid who's grown up in a culture that says that there's nothing wrong with being gay, and then he comes to his church and he's thrown out of the church for it, can't receive communion. I think that we need to do something about this. It's going to become a very big issue for the church. We're losing people very much because of it. I don't know how much of that you want to use. You can figure it out.
I hope all of it.
Thank you so much.
So thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for your insight. It was a revelation for us. It was an extraordinary set of opinions and views to have. We are very grateful for your generosity.